since I've not, you can clip this and send it to Andrewwilson if you like, since I've not been tasked with moderating that debate yet, I will say what my argument against Destiny's January 6th narrative is. First off, Destiny uses the term insurrection. Now, he has yet to define what insurrection means, and it's a very interesting choice of a word that he's making. The reason he's using that word is because he needs to connect January 6th and the actions of that day and the perceived violence that occurred there to the elector scheme. And the reason he needs to do that, and the Democrats need to do that, is because you're not going to get people fired up about Trump using alternate electors. That's not going to resonate with people. And before people say, oh, well, Rob's claiming that he's somehow better, that he talks... No, because, like, I talk about shit like FISA-gate, Russiagate, the Burisma scandal. That also doesn't resonate with average people. It doesn't. Fairly or unfairly. That's the truth. So if you're a Destiny supporter and you're listening and you're going, oh, that's ridiculous, you're saying the alternate elector. No, I'm just telling you, you might think that it's the biggest story in the world, but I'm telling you that it's going to be difficult to get the average person on board with it. They're going to be like, I don't know, it sounds weird, I don't know. That's what but the average person understands violence. They get that. And so that's what the Democrats and Destiny in particular are trying to do. They're trying to connect the alternate electors scheme with an insurrection, right? Now, to me, without looking up the definition, but insurrection implies some amount of violence. So, for example, you could theoretically buy your way into the presidency. Remember when Rob Blagojevich was sent to jail for allegedly selling like a Senate seat? He was like resigning from the Senate and he sold it to the highest bidder, basically. Like, that's not an insurrection, because there wasn't violence. You could say maybe you'd say it's a coup. Maybe you'd say it was elsewise stealing an election. But to me, the term insurrection implies violence. So when Destiny says that it was an insurrection, he has to say that Donald Trump was somehow involved in some sort of planning of a violent action, which he has zero proof of. So then we get to the day of January 6th itself. Was January 6th an insurrection? Now, the problem that Destiny's going to have is this: that he already made the argument that it is evident to anyone who objectively watched the footage that it wasn't a serious attempt to overthrow the government. He made that argument right after January 6th and up to a year later on panels that I was on and elsewhere. That was his argument. And the argument is sound and true, that if this was really an attempt to overthrow the government and to physically harm senators, etc., in order to wrest control of the government from them, they would have certainly did more. Because at this point, they already got past police, and even the official narrative is, when you see people like the police officers opening the doors and leaving people in, it's because they were overwhelmed. In other words, the mob was winning. That's why they said, okay, let's de-escalate, let's let them in. So if they really were going to attack the seats of power, they would have done more than basically mill around. Yes, there were clashes with police outside, but that was violence that got out of control. And Destiny even admits back then, he says, of course, there could have been some LARPers from places like the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers, etc., that maybe talked a big game about doing something, but the vast majority of the people there weren't involved in anything like that. Destiny, to steelman his position, will now be, with increased evidence, we now see that some 10 to 15% of the people there were involved in some sort of organization. Even still, clearly, the original argument that he made, which is self-evidently true, it wasn't an attempt to overthrow the government. It wasn't. So then the question becomes, okay, if it wasn't an attempt to overthrow the government, one, to me, then it's not an insurrection. But second, even if you want to broaden the definition to say it is an insurrection, the question is, what connection did Trump have towards that? And there's two areas of connection that they have. The first is the arguments that were made in the Colorado court case to keep Trump off the ballot. And that's basically that the tweets that Trump was putting out was a call to incitement of violence, which is absolute bullshit. Now, this was probably the most investigated day in the history of our FBI. I'm unaware of even one degree of communication between Trump and any of the people in the Proud Boys or anyone else that was charged with any sort of crime on January 6th. I've not seen any communications alleged between them where Trump was telling them what to do on January 6th. None. Zero. Not even claims from people that testified against him. Nothing. There's been no claims. So then how did Trump incite this? Well, it's from tweets that he put out that said things like, fight like hell. Literally a comment that basically every politician makes. Or when he retweeted someone from a group saying, the cavalry is coming. When he said, be peaceful, they had an expert testify in the Colorado trial, that actually was a dog whistle for be violent. And then what Destiny himself will say is, Trump told those people to march to the Capitol. Okay, well, simple. I used this explanation the other day. Let's say I leave this building that I'm in right now, and I get down the street and I see 4 guys playing basketball at the local basketball court, and I say, hey, you know what we're going to do? I got like a setup. I'm going to set up a DJ booth outside the local gas station. Bring your friends, come on down. It's going to be a blast. Let's go. So they grab 20 other people. They go down to the gas station, and I'm turning the tables, you know, killing it, you know. Everybody's having a blast. So I do it for an hour, and I'm like, thanks, guys. We'll see you later. And I leave, and they hang around, and then they're like, you know what we should do? Have a flash mob to go into the gas station and steal a bunch of shit. Did I incite that? Would Destiny say, but Rob, you told them to go there. Okay. So? Did I tell them to go be violent? Did I tell them to steal shit? No. Yes, it's undoubtable that what Donald Trump wanted was a big presence outside the Capitol as a signal to Mike Pence and to the Congress that people were outraged because they thought there were legitimate problems with the election and they wanted answers. And they felt like those answers weren't forthcoming. And there's no problem with Trump wanting them to do that. There's a problem if he wanted them to engage in violence, but there's no problem with them saying, have your voice peacefully heard. None at all. If they then engage in acts of violence, Trump's not responsible for those acts of violence. Simple. So that's the argument, well, he sent them there, so? Then the other argument is, but he didn't call the Secret Service. Now, this is laughable when you consider that literally the professionals that were in charge of security, with the exception of the head guy that was in charge, Capital City Police Chief Sund, who desperately requested the Secret Service over and over, or the National Guard over and over, all of them said no because of optics. There's a lot of hullabaloo about, did Trump request the National Guard be there before January 6th? It seems that he at least gave some sort of off-the-cuff comment about it. And even then, they were told no. We do know for a fact that Capitol Chief Sund has testified that he was not properly informed of the intelligence of what was going to go on January 6th. He thought that he was less informed than almost every other protest or rally that occurs in D.C., which always has better collaboration between various agencies. For some reason, he's incredibly skeptical at the lack of sharing of information at this one, even though we're told that the FBI had informants that were telling them that there was about to be an insurrection. Somehow that information never got delivered to the guy who was tasked with defending the Capitol. That guy directly went, Capitol Chief Sund directly, he had to go through a board in order to be able to request the National Guard. And I forget who the third person on that board is, but 2 of them are the Sergeant-at-Arms under the Senate, which would be under Mitch McConnell, and the Sergeant-at-Arms under Nancy Pelosi, whose name was Paul Irving. So he goes to Paul Irving first and says, can we have the National Guard? And Paul Irving hems and haws. Then he goes to the other guy under Mitch McConnell. And as soon as he walks in, he says he thought it was weird that right out of the gate, it was like the guy knew what he was going to say and was like, no, we can't do it. Months later, after January 6th, he would have dinner with that second Sergeant of Arms, whose name I'm sadly forgetting. And he said, can I ask you a question? It seemed like when I came and asked you that question, like you were already prepared for an answer and said that the answer was no. How did you know what I was going to ask? And he said, because Paul Irving, the Sergeant of Arms under Nancy Pelosi, called him and said, make something up. Nancy said no, she'll never go for it. So Nancy Pelosi directly said, according to the testimony of Capitol Chief Sund, he was told that Nancy Pelosi, even before January 6th, said, no, can't have the National Guard there. So that seems odd. Why was Trump supposed to overrule them? And you might say, okay, fine. That's before. Those are behaviors before January 6th. What about once January 6th occurred? What about once the riot started? Shouldn't then have Donald Trump declared the National Guard be there? Well, who do you think knows more about security? Donald Trump or Paul Irving? Or Lieutenant General, I forget his name, Williams maybe? Because Capitol Chief Sund requested over and over permission to ask for the National Guard, and Paul Irving kept saying, let me run it up the chain. Now, Paul Irving's only chain was Nancy Pelosi. And so for over an hour, Sund desperately called everyone he could think of, trying to get it waived so he could request the National Guard. They were told no for optics. If Donald Trump would have went over the wishes of Nancy Pelosi, professional security people, including generals, and said, oh, they're saying it's bad for optics, but I'm going to deploy them anyways, what would the narrative we'd be talking about today be? Donald Trump's a fascist. He deployed the military. He tried to make the National Guard his own Gestapo, his own brown shirts, in order to overthrow the government, to stay entrenched in power. That's what the professionals were saying, why they shouldn't deploy the Guard. So why should Trump have went over them? We then have Irving said that the first time that Sund called him, he said, yes, you could request the Guard. Sund says that's not true. He called several times and he has the receipts to prove it. Now, one of them directly lied to the January 6th committee. Why hasn't that been sussed out? Seems pretty clear. Sund's very confident. He says people were in the room. I have the receipts. I have the phone logs. I presented them all. So it sounds like Irving's lying. That's funny. Anyone who's connected to lying to the Trump team instantly goes to jail or charged with crimes. But this time, even when I talked to Pisco about this, he's like, I admit, it sounds like someone's not telling the truth, and it's probably Paul Irving. It's weird that there's not a big clamoring for that person to be held account, huh? By the way, the other Sergeant at Arms, he's dead now. So he didn't make it very long after January 6th. Donald Trump did, about an hour after it was getting out of control, he did tweet out that people should be calm, that the police were on our side and they're great patriots. Then he told people to go home around 4 o'clock. Is it possible that Trump should have said, hey, whoa, things are getting out of hand, calm down, don't engage in acts of violence? Yeah, it's possible. Now, two caveats to that. One caveat. When you look at the actual footage from that day, most of it wasn't that. Most of the damage that was occurring to police was self-inflicted. Like they would shoot tear gas into a mostly peaceful crowd and then end up hitting themselves and their own officers. For example, when you see the sort of initial breach, some of the people that were charged with assaulting police officers were doing things like this, shoving signs into police officers. Well, that's what Ray Epps did, but he wasn't charged with violence. And when you look at it, you're like, it's not that bad. But that's what many of the other people were charged with. Now, no doubt, once things got heated, there certainly were people that deserved to be charged that were engaged in acts of violence. But overwhelmingly, it wasn't as violent as you're led to believe. Yes, there were isolated patches that there was violent interactions occurring. But the idea that Donald Trump was sitting there and was like, wow, did it look worse than, say, May 31st, 2020, when the National Guard wasn't deployed? No, that looked way worse. As far as they were using Molotov cocktails. Did it look worse than the Summer of Love, where we were told that it would be authoritarian to deploy the National Guard? No. Didn't. And they all screamed that Trump couldn't deploy the Guard, and that would be fascism. Tom Cotton wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, said maybe we should deploy the National Guard. No, that'd be fascism, said the writers at the New York Times. They threatened to quit until they removed the op-ed, which they did. So this one time, though, Trump was supposed to override all of that. Having said all of that, I do think Trump should have done more. I absolutely do. I think Trump was desperately trying to convince Mike Pence, and he thought, oh, they're smearing my supporters. They're almost all mostly peaceful. Fuck these people that lied for all year about the riots that we saw on the left. And now we see things getting out of hand on the right, and they want me to jump in when they didn't say shit. I'm not concerned about that right now. I'm concerned about convincing Mike Pence. We think the election was stolen. You got to do something. That's hardly inciting an insurrection, though. Who's the better debater? I haven't seen Haas a lot, to be honest. That's the argument about January 6th being an insurrection and Trump inciting it. It wasn't an insurrection. Or if you want to say, well, I've broadened the definition so much, well, then May 31st, when violent lefties attacked the White House, was an insurrection. And there were dozens of Black Lives Matter rallies that would also be insurrections. No problem, Calvin. Now, that's just half the answer to his objection, right? Because what his real beef isn't January 6th. He just understands optically you have to tie January 6th to the elector scheme because people aren't going to get excited about a legal challenge. So you have to make it sound like a violent insurrection. And again, to me, the term insurrection implies a certain amount of violence. I don't think Destiny has any good answer as to how that was an insurrection, given that he's already admitted that it clearly was a riot that got out of control, or how Trump's connected to it, other than that he was there. But still could be true that the alternate elector scheme was very damaging on its own right. And that's where Destiny spends most of his time arguing. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not a lawyer, and I haven't delved too deeply. I've probably read 80 to 90 pages of material on this, but I certainly haven't done the work that I have on other subjects. I'll fully admit that. I think I should be given a little grace. I think I've done more work on it than fucking 99% of people, particularly right and left-wing commentators and streamers. Even still, I should do more, but I have a full-time job. It's tough. Yeah, if Andrew was smart, he would absolutely, immediately get Destiny to define the term insurrection. And he should be prepared for examples of other insurrections that would meet Destiny's definition to see if Destiny was as hyperbolic about those as he is about this one. That's absolutely how Andrew should start the debate. So the elector scheme. What the elector scheme was an attempted legal challenge by Trump's team to force state-level courts to look at allegations of illegality in the 2020 election. That's what it was. It was a legal attempt to have an investigation. That's what occurred. That's it. You may disagree. You may even think that that legal attempt was unconstitutional. The question is, does it rise to the level of criminality? I don't believe it does. For example, is Joe Biden's student loan scheme constitutional? Is it? I say no. The court said no initially. Does that mean Joe Biden goes to jail? Of course not. Presidents, governors, politicians, etc. do things all the time that are considered illegal, unconstitutional. We don't criminalize them and say, okay, now you go to jail. Capitol flag's been lowered to half staff. I don't know. So, in a nutshell, what occurred was there were various states where there were allegations being told to Trump by people. Voting machines going haywire, illegals voting, problems with mail-in ballots, questions of the legality of mail-in ballots and other forms of voting, etc. Trump couldn't get these cases heard. Now, the way that, I don't have the specific dates in front of me, but basically the way this works is there is, I don't know if it's the Constitution specifically or just laws that have derived from the Constitution that says that there is a time frame for when things have to occur. So the electors need to be sent to Washington by a certain time. They need to be counted and accepted by a certain date, etc. So the problem would be this. Let's say, we'll take my state of Pennsylvania because I happen to know a little more about it. One of the objections that Trump's team had in Pennsylvania was that mail-in ballots themselves in Pennsylvania are against the Constitution of Pennsylvania. You might say that sounds ridiculous. It's not that ridiculous. In fact, a court originally found that yes, that was absolutely true, that the mail-in votes were against the Constitution of Pennsylvania. Now, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania has since overruled that. But there was about a 3 or 4 month period where in Pennsylvania, mail-in ballots were illegal. Now, let's say that that would have stuck, hypothetically, right? Let's say that there was an argument that we think that these mail-in ballots, the changing of the law surrounding the 2020 election to accept mass mail-in ballots was unconstitutional. If it's unconstitutional, that means those ballots shouldn't count, which means Trump won Pennsylvania, right? Let's say that a court ruled, you're right, and then the Supreme Court said, yes, you're right. What would have happened if there wasn't an alternate slate of electors? What would have happened? Well, Biden would have been declared the winner. He would have been sworn in. About 7 months into his presidency, a court would have said, oh no, Pennsylvania was wrong, the ballots here were wrong, and let's say another state did that as well, and it was enough to switch the election that Trump should have won. Too late. They're not going to redo the election. They're not going to hand it to Trump. They'll say, well, next time you can't do that. That's it. You've already been sworn in. Game over. That's what's occurring. I looked into this a little. I'd need to talk to a lawyer that could explain this better, but apparently things like this occur in law quite frequently, where you'll file a placeholder litigation. In case something happened, we have a certain time frame. We have 2 years to file a suit, but we're still not sure if we're going to do it. So you basically do a placeholder thing so that it extends the time frame that you have. That's what was occurring. How do we respond to this argument in addition to Trump calling for the suspension of the Constitution? When Trump's calling for the suspension of the Constitution, what he's talking about is the argument that we have to declare a winner, the electors have to be called at a certain time. Trump's basically saying, look, the Constitution outlines timeframes and rules for the process of electing a president. But if it's incredibly fraudulent, we have to suspend that time frame in the rules that we normally have because the whole process was corrupt. That's what he's saying. Now, I think it's a terrible thing to say, particularly as someone who favors the Constitution like myself. My friend Aircraft Sparky here is really fucking infuriated by the fact that Trump said that. Like, go listen to his stream someday. He'll tell you all about it. To him, that was almost a defining moment for Trump. And I understand. But the problem is, Trump often shoots his mouth off and says crazy shit. And you may argue that that's a reason that he shouldn't be president, and it's a fair argument. It's fair. I disagree, though. I think Trump's just like he's like the dude. It's like, why don't we just fucking bomb all those people? And someone's like, yeah, we can't do that. Yeah, you can't just bomb people like that. Oh, okay. What were the results, though? Trump's got a big mouth, and did he lock all of his opponents up? No, that's what the Democrats do. Did he try to keep people off the ballot? No, that's the Democrats. That's what they do. You see, the Democrats' argument is, hypothetically, Trump was going to be an authoritarian, suggested going after his opponents and doing this, that, and the other. And then what happened in reality? Nothing. Did he leave office January 20th? Yeah, he did. That's another argument that Destiny will make. Destiny makes the argument, well, Rob says that what would have happened, this is what would have happened. What would have happened would have been as follows. I'm 90% sure. I have to look into the legality of this a little more. So what would have happened would have been something like this. If you read the memo from Eastman, his attorney, this would have then forced, if Pence had accepted the alternate slate or said, I'm not sure, I can't accept either slate, what would have happened then, it would have went back to the states who would have argued within each state whether or not these fraud issues or constitutionality issues occurred. If the Democrats are right and there was no evidence of fraud or anything like that, then fine. What would have happened would have been Joe Biden would have been declared the winner. If some states would have said, no, we see fraud, we're now going to shift, what would have happened would have been the same as Bush v. Gore, that the Supreme Court would have came in and said, now we're going to look. The argument that Destiny will make is, but how do you know that if the courts ruled against Trump, that he would have inevitably left? And you know how I know? Because he left. Because if your argument is, even if the court ruled against him, he wouldn't have left, then why did he leave? In fact, according to Destiny and the entire Democratic Party, a few thousand Trump supporters literally was on the cusp of violently overthrowing the government without any weapons. So at that point, they knew they had them by the balls, right? Trump supporters are mighty. They could overthrow the government at a whim, right? So why'd he leave? Maybe it's because they're hyperbolic and full of shit. Now you may be, by the way, I was never for Mike Pence accepting the alternate electors, and I'm one of the few people that will admit to you, presuming Joe Biden finishes out his term, If Trump wins and Kamala Harris is vice president and says, I'm going to accept an alternate slate of electors, I'll be fucking pissed. Absolutely. Would be pissed. But I don't think Kamala Harris committed a crime. I just say it should be rejected and Trump should be declared the winner. I don't know what Andrew will do on that point. Well, if they don't leave, then it's a different situation. It does look bad optically, it does. But it's a legal challenge. Now, conversely, the Times Magazine article that talked about a shadowy cabal fortifying the election for Biden, it says that they were lined up with legal challenges out the wazoo if Biden had lost. There would have, I almost 100% guarantee that there would have been talks of alternate slates of electors. The problem was, because there was so little faith in our election going into 2020 because of the massive changes that resulted from COVID, whoever lost was going to cry bullshit. Would it have been criminality? If, for example, we find out that people that were involved in that shadowy cabal Time Magazine talks about, had they pre-discussed, okay, how do we get alternate electors? Did they commit a crime? At what point is it a crime for Donald Trump to talk about this? Is the mere act of talking to his lawyers and saying maybe we should do this alternate, is having that suggestion, that discussion, is that the crime? Or is it only once they actually get the alternate electors? That's the crime. Let's say I think that the Pennsylvania system is broken and I send a form after the 2024, regardless who wins, it doesn't matter, I say it's broken. Let's say Trump wins here in Pennsylvania and I declare myself an elector and send a form to Kamala Harris and say, Kamala, I am one of the real electors because the whole thing was fraudulent and really you won. Did I commit a crime by just sending that? You'd say, well, shit, you can send whatever you want, right? They're just like, no, we're not going to accept this. Yeah, Destiny he's doing better now because we're away from the emotional losses that the Democrats were receiving, so he's more calm because he's a petulant child. That's what happens. When you're of a privileged class, equal treatment seems like discrimination. When you root for the establishment and they win 99% of the time, you don't know what it feels like to get a couple losses. That's what happens. And so you lash out. You scream, you rail against, that guy deserved to die. If it was my parents, they deserved it too. Fuck around, find out. All Trump supporters that go to a rally have to... That's the type of shit you say when you're not used to taking losses. I even tweeted out the other day, I said, hey, now that they got Biden out of the race, and I think that definitely improves Democrats' chances of winning. So that's seen as somewhat of a victory for Democrats. Can those the crybabies that were whining now stop saying that they wanted Trump assassinated or that Trump supporters are fucking around and finding out? Can they calm down a little on the rhetoric now? The last thing I'll say, and this is something that Andrewwilson should certainly say, Destiny focuses a lot on the Supreme Court immunity decision, and he claims that that decision basically makes Trump unprosecutable. He's a king, he's above the law. That's not what the decision did. Even if I think there are legitimate criticisms that Destiny and Pisco could make. And at some point, I've agreed to talk to Pisco about that because, I'll be honest with you, I'm not so sure how off Pisco is. If I could give my comments on the immunity decision, admitting, again, that I've only read about 70 to 80 pages of this decision, here's my take on why I think there is a legitimate, reasonable criticism. I do not want a world where a president has total immunity. However, I do not want a world where presidents can be charged like anyone else for anything. Because it is clear what will happen will be that the legal system will be weaponized by the opposition every single time in order to use lawfare to stop their opponents, which is what the Democratic Party is doing right now to Donald Trump. And we see the results of what that looks like. I think that's absurd. You're leading to state prosecutors just on a whim, coming up with novel legal theories that have never been done, charging Trump with felonies just so they could say, oh, he's a convicted felon. You want to vote for a convicted felon? That's nonsensical. Clearly, it would get out of control very quick. So I wanted the Supreme Court to make a decision that basically said, listen, Of course, the standard for prosecuting a president is higher than the average person. And presidents can get away with some things that the average person can't, but not everything. There definitely are things that can be prosecuted. And ultimately, this decision accomplishes that. It says that there are 3 types of scenarios that you could look at criminally charging a president. The first is what they call the core duties. A core duty would be something like pardoning power. The Constitution blatantly says the president has to pardon. So the argument would be you can't prosecute a president for a pardon. So let's say that Biden comes out tomorrow and says, I'm pardoning my son Joe Biden or I'm pardoning my son Hunter Biden because Hunter Biden has a bunch of evidence of crimes I've committed. Or Hunter Biden, how about this? Hunter Biden's given me $1 million to pardon him, so I'm going to do it. And you say, that's bribery, you can't do that. He could pardon, you can't charge him for the pardon. And it makes sense because every single pardon that's given then would then be investigated. Why did he do that? Was he given something in return? Which basically nullifies the pardoning power because now you're pardoning people for a reason. So if we can investigate that reason. So I get it. It makes sense. That's section 1. Can't prosecute. You have immunity from core behaviors as the president. Got it. Then there's things that are not your duty whatsoever. For example, president gets drunk, driving, runs over a person on the street. Absolutely could be prosecuted, even while they're president. Because it has nothing to do with the official duties of being a president. Makes sense. I'm for that. Then there's the third area, which is the gray area. And those are things that are official duties, but not core duties, or part official and part non-official duties. And what the court said was, you can prosecute for those sort of behaviors, but there is presumptive immunity. And so we presume that a president's immune. Therefore, it's up to the prosecutors to go in front of a legal body, a court, etc., to argue, here's why we think what we're prosecuting needs to happen. And the burden is that they have to be able to prove to a court that this prosecution won't interfere with the official duties of the office of the presidency. So that's the threshold. Now, you could still meet that threshold. Arguably, they could meet that threshold with the classified documents case or with the electors case. But they would have to prove it. The reason they're freaking the fuck out is because it seems that there are serious questions about what evidence could be used, such as the core duty of talking to your attorney general can't be used as evidence. And more importantly, because they feel that this means that these cases now won't be heard until after the election. Because what they're really concerned about is locking Trump up before the election because they're not confident they could win on Joe Biden's record. So all the gnashing of the teeth and the yelling and screaming, that's what's really occurring. They're pissed off they can't throw Trump in jail for these charges before the election. That's all it is, right? So Sotomayor makes the argument, well, listen, wouldn't this mean that the president could use SEAL Team 6 to assassinate his opponent? And that's the argument that you hear people like Destiny making, right? Here's the problem. They know that's bullshit. They know that's not true. But they sort of have a point. This is what they're getting at. The problem with this decision, and there's a legit argument here, is who gets to define what a core duty is? Because the core duties have absolute immunity. So who defines those? And there's not a good answer. Pardoning's easy. It's directly said in the Constitution. But the court says discussions with a president and their attorney general is a core duty because one of the core duties of the president is to enforce the law. So his chief law enforcement person is the attorney general. So those conversations need to be protected. That's part of his core duty. But it's not clear that that's what the Constitution's saying. Okay, yeah, you enforce the law as the chief executive, but does that mean that part of your core duty is talking to the attorney general? Where's the threshold? It's a solid argument. And so the way they draw it out to an absurd extent to try to prove the point is saying, well, the president's the chief of the military. So does that mean if he orders SEAL Team 6 to kill his opponent, that too is part of his core duty that he would have immunity from? Yeah, we could talk about that, Omar. But the truth is, the SEAL Team 6 scenario would never occur, because oftentimes what happens is the court will make decisions like this, but then when a scenario comes up that's clearly like insanely ridiculous, they sort of just ignore. They're like, okay. And that's what would happen. For example, if Biden right now ordered the assassination of Trump, if that legitimately happened, and he just came out and was like, yeah, I'm the chief law enforcement executive. We had credible evidence that Donald Trump was a terrorist. We ordered his assassination. That's it. There is zero chance the Supreme Court wouldn't say, yeah, you could absolutely investigate that. He does not have immunity. And you might say, but that's the reality. And they know that. And I bet if I debate them, at least Pisco would admit that. So it's more about not being able to prosecute Trump now. Now, the truth is, they don't believe what they're saying, because they'll still favor Jack Smith going forward with his case. They won't say, no, that's part of Trump's core duty. He has absolutely immunity. They won't. So they know that this doesn't give Trump immunity from everything ever. They know that. They're just pissed off because they were gung-ho. These cases are going to get Trump. That's what it was. That's what all the gnashing of the teeth is. So when you hear Destiny yelling and screaming, Trump's gay, and I've seen his audience sort of make this argument, I don't know about him, which is something to this effect. Well, when you have a legal method in order to take out a tyrant, then you use it. So if you could vote out Adolf Hitler, then you vote him out. But what if you can't? What if he suspends elections? What if he puts himself above the law? What if his courts say you can no longer do anything to him? Well, now you could go outside the scope of the law. That's the argument they say. So the hyperbolic, it was an insurrection. They tried to steal the election. All of it's hyperbolic. They've made Trump an emperor. He's above the law. They've gaslit themselves into thinking that Trump is Hitler and he had a violent attempt to overthrow the country to stay in power, and that the courts gave him the thumbs up and said, that's okay, you can do it. That's not what happened. At all. And the question that Andrewwilson should ask Destiny is this. Well, what should have happened if Trump's team brought cases to the courts and they were unwilling to be heard? What do you think Destiny's argument would be? What should have, put your left-leaning hat on. What should have happened if Trump's team thought that there were legal challenges that the courts were unwilling to hear or wouldn't have time to hear? What should have happened? What should they have done? Anyone? What do you think he'd say? I think it's simple. I know exactly what they'd say. Because they said it. Trump and Trump supporters say, oh, the courts wouldn't even hear our cases. What do they say? Too bad. That's it. That was your chance. That's what they say. There's nothing more. Hey, that's it. The election's over. The courts have weighed in. Right? That's what they say. Anyone disagree? Hey, my chat's not working, or let me see. There we go. It's working. Everybody agrees, right? It's all right, John. Question was, what would Destiny and the Democrats say if you said, but wait a minute, Trump's team was upset that the courts wouldn't weigh in, that they wouldn't hear these cases? They'll say, too bad. Let's say they were all dismissed on standing. They'll still say the same thing. So, hey, that's the system. Sorry. Right? Everyone agrees. That's what they'd say, right? You don't get to do the alternate elector stuff. You don't get to do that. You don't get to do January 6th. No. Sorry. You tried. You took it to court. Court said no. That's it. That's their argument. Why is it different now? Court just said, no. Trump has presumptive immunity. And all of a sudden, Destiny's argument is, that's bullshit. That's not fair. But wait a minute, Destiny. When it came to claims of election fraud and illegalities with the 2020 election, you said the courts were the final arbiter. We had to listen. That was his argument. And largely he's right. So why is it different now? Now when the court weighs in a way he doesn't like, he says, that's outrageous. How is it that Destiny says that the Supreme Court's basically in the pocket of Donald Trump? Then why were they unwilling to hear Texas's case about the 2020 election? If they're really there to ensure that Trump never leaves office and destroys democracy, why were they unwilling to even hear the case? And that's the truth. The truth is, Destiny and the Democrats are acting exactly like what they've criticized from Trump and his supporters. By any means necessary is what they're saying. Trump had a legal challenge that didn't work. And I'm glad Mike Pence didn't accept it. But had he accepted it, one of two outcomes would have inevitably occurred. Either one, there would have been definitive evidence of fraud or illegality that would have been shown, and Trump would have been declared the winner. The Democrats assure us that that's impossible. It wouldn't have happened. Okay, fair enough. Then what would have happened was the courts would have weighed in eventually that Trump lost, that Joe Biden was the legitimate winner, and Trump would have stepped down. That's what would have happened. So, that's my long-winded definitive answer to what Destiny says about the insurrection in January 6th. That's what's going on. They've gaslit themselves so bad into that this was like a violent overthrow of the government and the courts have signed off on it and Trump has immunity from everything whatsoever and he's going to kill democracy and never leave office, that they find themselves saying fucked up things like, if you go to a Trump rally, fuck around and find out. If you get shot, no sympathy.